Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm Kloiber, and in the next 25 minutes, we're going to talk about a rather hot topic these days about data and technology during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm joined by two guests, by Janina Voigt. She's a software engineer and team lead at the Google Safety Engineering Center in Munich. Hi, Janina. And by Professor Björn Scheuermann. He's a professor and chair of computer engineering at the Humboldt University of Berlin and the research director at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. Hi, Björn. Welcome. In this session, we will discuss how data can eventually help us fight the virus. We will, however, also look at the limitations of technology in this context. And since both of our guests are security experts, we will, of course, also talk about privacy in this regard. And before we dive into some questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of this session for you to ask us some questions that we will answer, Janina will give us a brief overview on a tool that she and her team at the Google Safety Engineering Center in Munich have been working on in the past couple of weeks. Janina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On Friday, 3rd of April, we published the first version of our COVID-19 community mobility reports. These reports show changes in mobility patterns in over 120 countries around the world. For example, how many people are going to work or the grocery store compared to before the lockdown started. The data in the reports is highly aggregated and anonymized to protect your privacy. These reports are accessible to anyone. You can go to our website, pick the country you're interested in, and see for yourself how movement has changed in your country to various categories of places, such as retail and recreation, groceries and pharmacies, parks, transit stations, and workplaces. Here you can see a screenshot of what these reports look like. The reports show a percentage increase or decrease rather than the absolute number of visits, compared to a baseline value from earlier in 2020. For some countries, we also published regional and state-level reports, because we know that that's often where key public health decisions are being made. This, for example, is the report for 2 states in Germany. Our first launch was an early release of these reports to get feedback from the community. We're now updating the data every few days. Our team is also working on providing data for more countries, as well as more regional data. The reports are based on location history data. Location history is an optional feature in your Google account that saves where you go into a private timeline. We usually use this data to give you a more personalized user experience. For example, better restaurant recommendations, or suggestions for how to make your commute faster. Your data will only be represented in the mobility reports if you opted into this Google feature, which is actually turned off by default. You can pause or unpause at any time, delete the data, or tell us at Google to automatically delete the data after 3 or 18 months. If you decide that you would like to opt in or out of location history, or you want to learn more about this, there are several ways to do this. If you're on your phone, I would recommend using the Google Maps timeline feature that you can find in the Google Maps settings menu. We know that your location history data is very personal and sensitive. That's why we built these reports with privacy in mind right from the very beginning, making sure that we're treating your data with respect. We are not sharing data about your location, movements, or contacts. The data in the report is highly aggregated and anonymized, and is based on location history, which is disabled unless you explicitly opted in. We are also sharing the reports publicly on our website so that you can see what's in them. Everyone is getting access to the same data. I've mentioned anonymization and anonymized data several times already. What exactly do I mean when I say that? When we anonymize data, we process it in such a way that it cannot be tied back to you. This sounds simple in theory, but there are a number of pitfalls that make anonymization tricky to get right. It's not enough to just remove personally identifiable information. We also need to ensure that it can never be reconstructed. In our reports, we're using a cutting-edge anonymization technique called differential privacy to provide further guarantees. At Google, we see differential privacy as the strongest standard of anonymization. I'm excited to talk to you about this today because I see differential privacy as a technology that's still relatively young, but has huge potential to help all of us achieve a balance between making data useful and at the same time protecting you from being personally identifiable. In addition to the COVID mobility reports, we also use differential privacy in the Google Maps feature that you might have seen that shows you how busy a restaurant or tourist attraction is at particular times of the day. Similarly to the mobility reports, this is based on location history data, and you are only represented if you've opted into location history. The core idea behind differential privacy is this. Assume that you are represented in our mobility reports. Now remove your data, perhaps by opting out of location history. This should not significantly change the mobility reports. What does that tell us? It tells us that your contribution is not really visible in the final output, and hence your privacy is protected. Differential privacy achieves this property by adding noise to the data to mask individual user contributions. The cool thing about differential privacy for engineers like me is that we can actually use mathematical formulas to represent the risk of exposing sensitive data, thus allowing us to make mathematical guarantees about your privacy. Let's look at an example. Imagine you're attending a conference, and the moderator shares some insights about the audience, presenting statistics about the nationality of participants. It's a 2-day conference, and almost everyone attended both days, except for one person, who could only join for the second day. If we know this, it's easy to see from the data that our late participant is French. This statistic is not differentially private, since a single user's contribution is obvious in the result. Instead, the moderator could have protected user privacy by adding just a little noise to the data. As you can see here, the added noise means that we don't even know if there were any new participants on day 2. At the same time, we can still draw significant conclusions from the data. For example, we can see that most participants in the conference come from the UK. Of course, if we add too much noise, at some point the noise takes over and the data becomes less useful. At Google, we've worked on differential privacy since 2014, and we have a number of experts in the field working with us. But I'm really hopeful that this exciting technology can have a positive impact on user privacy far beyond Google.
Thank you, Janina, for this overview and presentation. Over to you, Björn. From what we've heard so far, what are your thoughts on the mobility report? Is it good that all of this data has been collected so we can now make use of it?
Yeah, first of all, thanks also from my side for making this information available to a broader community, also outside Google. I think that's very worthwhile, and looking at this data, obviously there are things to learn from it. And thanks also for the nice introduction in the presentation to differential privacy. Good to hear this sometimes rather tricky concept so well explained. When seeing the mobility reports, actually, I was in two minds. There are two hearts beating in my breast with that regard, and they are to some extent contradictory. So maybe that also paves the ground for our discussion afterwards. First of all, well, the scientist in me shouts, "I want more of this." This answers tiny bits of questions, and as soon as I go beyond this, well, I hit the boundaries of what you're making available at this point. I don't see any statistical confidences. I don't know whether this change is due to the noise from differential privacy, due to the noise of who participated at that point in time, or actually a significant change. So I want more. That's what the scientist in me says. On the other hand, I know there are limits in differential privacy. So this type of data you're looking at, where essentially you're counting people, is like the prime use case where differential privacy applies well, because adding or removing one single person changes the data only by a small amount. If we look at other types of data where adding or removing one single participant can change the data potentially a lot, that's, for instance, the case in so-called long-tail distributions, where some individuals contribute a lot, like wealth distributions, where you have a small number of very wealthy people. In that case, differential privacy is inherently very hard to apply, because you'd have to add so much noise that essentially makes the data worthless. That's the other side, the other opinion I'm carrying around. So if we want more of this, is differential privacy really the only way to go and the right way to go? Or don't we need to think about other ways which take more of the possible context knowledge of the data receivers into account?
Yeah,
so that's the two comments I can give on that. And yes, I'm fully aware they are contradictory.
Yeah. Janina, do you want to respond to that? I guess, I mean, since you've been working on this for a couple of weeks, I guess you've wrapped your head around like all different aspects of details in the data and like at what level of granularity you're going to publish it. Yeah, so feel free to reply to what you've just heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually very much agree with you, Björn. I think this is a balancing act, right, between the accuracy of the data and people's privacy. I think location data, which the reports are based on, is just so sensitive that, and as you said, it's a perfect use case for differential privacy. So I think in this case, it was a relatively clear choice for us as to what we wanted to do. Of course, being aware of all of the consequences that you mentioned. But I think it's a really interesting point that you raised, that differential privacy applies to certain topics, but maybe not to others, and that there are probably other technologies that are also privacy-preserving technologies that we might need for different use cases as well.
Yeah, I mean, from a user's perspective, right? If you hear all of this, you might be thinking, wow, this is a great tool. Like, how good differential privacy is in preserving high-level analysis while still ensuring the individual's privacy. So users might be wondering, like, why does Google even need the location, my exact location data history, or why do they need to keep it? So what would you answer a user asking you that, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, as Björn said, it's not applicable everywhere. We also do use it in other places, with the Google Maps being a good example of the busyness of restaurants distribution. So we do always look for ways of applying differential privacy internally at Google as well. It's still a pretty new technology, right? Having said that, it's we started working on it in, I believe, 2014, but it's still a very active research area. So I think there's more to be done here generally within Google and beyond.
So talking about data and technology during the COVID pandemic, of course, we also have to talk about the widely discussed Corona apps. Are you looking forward to installing the German Corona app on your phones?
To whom does this question go?
Both of you, whoever has an answer first.
I will, of course, look at the final version of this app before I'm looking forward to install it. Actually, based on the current state of affairs, the current status of the discussion, I would say we have found a pretty good way to make sure that this data can only be used for that purpose. And for me personally, and this is a very personal decision of everyone, this is the key criterion.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. Yeah, I think the current state of discussions is really good. I think there have been a lot of technical discussions around different kinds of models that can be applied. But I think what I'm seeing in the discussion is that everyone really does care about protecting people's privacy, and that a lot of thought has gone into how we do that in the right way, so that we give users the best possible story. Because I think ultimately this is an app that requires broad coverage to really work. And so trust and having people really feel like they can install this is going to be paramount to making this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and trust brings me to actually a Netzpolitik blog post, Björn, that you and some colleagues of yours wrote, right? Where you also talk about the different kind of options, the decentralized approach, the centralized approach, and you also talk about trust, that it's not only about the technological possibilities, but to establish trust and that people really use the app. So as we all know, Germany finally opted for the approach, the decentralized approach, the approach that was preferred by civil society organizations, or the majority of them, and by researchers. So now I'm wondering, okay, we are going for the decentralized approach, but what are things that we still have to consider, that we still need to take into account in order to ensure people's privacy, if there are any?
Yeah, of course there are, because still you can make lots and lots of mistakes even if you follow a fully decentralized design. You can have problems in the implementation of your app which compromise the devices. Just assume that independent from the model where the data is stored and to whom it should be revealed at which point, there's just an implementation mistake in the app which makes it vulnerable to attacks. Getting the data in that way, in a way that was never planned, that was never part of the system design. So of course, there are still things that could go wrong, but well, to some extent, one has to keep his or her paranoia under control. So this is why I said I will take a careful look at what is served before I install anything, but that's a general lesson that everyone should keep in mind, and that's not particularly related to this app or this concept.
But you have, as a professor, you have the means, and you have to know how to know what's going on in the background, right? So I guess transparency will be key to whatever option is chosen.
Yes.
Yeah,
of course.
And I mean, another thing like that people are wondering, this is the COVID pandemic now, like how many of these kind of technological things that we're developing now are going to stick? Will we have a flu app for the next big flu? Will this stick, and will Corona basically become a blueprint for using data and analytic tools in a new way? What's your take on this?
That's actually what first came to my mind when you started formulating your previous question. Beyond the technical aspects, beyond making sure that the technology is trustworthy and is well implemented, and there are no hidden issues in that regard, we have to think about the societal impact of these technologies. Even if we now come up with a perfect design which privacy preserving in the perfect way everyone could only wish for, then still it will change the way in which people think about this type of technology. We will get used to using that kind of app to tackle this kind of problem. And we have to take care what that means in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, if there are other problems. And we are used to just download the app and give away data to whatever extent in order to solve that problem. That's an instinct where society and all of us have to make sure that we don't give up too much because we get used to it. And on that level, and also on other levels, this will have an impact that reaches far beyond technology.
Yeah. I think from our sorry, I was just going to add from our side at Google, we've added some APIs that will be used for developing this app, but we've also been clear that this is only for this use case, right? We're not extending this to other use cases, and we're only allowing this to be used by public health officials. And I mean, just to add this, because I know it's a concern for people, we're not building our own apps for Google and Apple, where it's just governments doing it. We're not going to have access to that data. But I agree with Björn that it's an interesting question of how society develops beyond this, because I think we can expect there to be some big changes in how we all operate as humans in society.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of hope that people put into these technologies, apparently. But I'm wondering, where do you see the limitations of the technologies? Like Bruce Schneier published a blog post last week where he talks about not the security, but the efficiency of these apps. And he has major doubt that the app will have a great impact on fighting the virus. So what are some of your thoughts around the limitations of technology? Have you come across some limitations already? And why is it important to think this systematic?
I think the first thing I would maybe say, sorry, Björn, is that the technology is only one part of the puzzle here, right? I think there's going to be lots of pieces that need to fall into place, first of all. We already talked about differential privacy and the fact that there are probably many different technologies that will be needed going forward. The one thing that I find exciting at the moment is that we're actually talking about those technologies and we're working on developing them. So I think hopefully that bodes well for the future.
Yeah. So from my side, adding to that, coming across technological limitations is maybe at the heart of my job description, and probably at Janina's too. So I'm used to that, and I'm very aware where they are. And at least to some extent, I'm fully with Bruce Schneier. This is not a panacea. This is not the one thing that will solve this crisis. It's just one puzzle piece, and probably a rather small puzzle piece. But adding small puzzle pieces to the whole can still help. And if it helps only a little bit, and only in certain situations, it might still be worth doing. It's just not that we should expect that this app is there and suddenly things are good.
Yeah, I think this is a great final statement. I was going to ask you what we should learn from this crisis, and maybe this is what we should learn from this crisis, that technology won't solve it all, that there are certain limitations, that it is valuable for all of us to look deeper into some theories and to what can be done with certain means and what cannot be done. So thank you for this conversation. We're now going to move to the Q&A, where all of you in the audience can ask us some questions, and I'm sure there are some questions. So thank you for now, and we're going to move over to Zoom. See you there in a bit. Thank you.